The year 1872 had settled upon Willow Creek, Kentucky, with an uncharacteristic hush. It was a stillness that preceded the true chill of winter, a quietude that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. This was a place etched into the very fabric of the Appalachian foothills, a community bound by the rhythms of harvest and the solemn toll of the church bell. Generations had lived and died within its quiet embrace, their stories woven into the very soil, and rarely did anything truly disrupt the predictable currents of life. But that autumn, an anomaly began to ripple through the valley, an incident so deeply unsettling that it seemed to fray the edges of the familiar world. The source of this creeping unease was the Ebersol family, whose modest farm lay nestled on the outskirts of Willow Creek, near the meandering bend of the river. Elias Ebersol, a man forged from the stern stuff of the earth, spoke little, preferring the honest language of toil. His wife, Martha, was the gentle counterpoint, known for her tender hand with ailing creatures and her boundless, almost fierce devotion to their only son, Thomas. Thomas, at 10 years old, was a child apart, not frail or sickly, but imbued with a solemnity that belied his years, a gaze that seemed to pierce the veil of the mundane, seeing truths hidden from common sight. Thomas was not a boisterous child, nor did he seek the company of other boys his age. His days were spent in the hushed cathedral of the woods behind their farm, not in playful abandon, but with an almost sacred purpose. He would return, often hours later, clutching strange, smooth river stones or twisted pieces of driftwood, artifacts he would then study with an intensity that bordered on reverence, as if each object held a cryptic message only he was meant to decipher. His parents, though at times perplexed by his solitary nature, attributed it to a sensitive spirit, a mind inclined towards introspection rather than the rough and tumble of farm life. Yet, as the vibrant greens of summer yielded to the fiery golds and russets of autumn, Thomas's introspective quietude deepened into something more profound, something akin to a detached melancholy. His already slight appetite dwindled, his supper plate often remaining untouched as his gaze drifted towards the fading light beyond the kitchen window. His words grew sparse, and when he did speak, they were fragments, riddles spun from a mind that seemed to be charting a course entirely separate from the earthly concerns of home and hearth. He spoke of the path, of the crossing, phrases that Martha, with growing alarm, could not reconcile with the innocent wanderings of a child. Martha, her heart a heavy stone in her chest, ceaselessly attempted to draw him back, to coax him with stories, with promises of shared tasks, with gentle inquiries. But Thomas would only offer a vacant stare, his eyes holding a depth that chilled her, or a soft, almost inaudible murmur that faded into the quiet air. Even Elias, a man grounded in the tangible world of soil and seasons, felt the cold tendrils of an indefinable dread coil within him when he looked upon his son, whose vibrant, youthful spark seemed to be dimming, fading, like the last embers of a dying fire in the hearth. The morning of October 17th dawned gray and damp, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a quintessential Kentucky autumn day. But for the Ebersol household, this particular dawn would forever be etched into their memories, the moment when the unsettling whispers became a terrifying, undeniable reality. Martha, rising before the first hint of light, found Thomas's small bed undisturbed, the covers neatly folded as if he had never rested there. A shard of panic, sharp and cold, pierced her heart. She roused Elias from his deep slumber, and together, their voices laced with escalating fear, they searched the small farmhouse. They found him not in his usual haunts, nor in any place a 10-year-old might choose for secret solitude. He was in the parlor, a room reserved for solemn occasions, for the quiet contemplation of Sundays, its polished oak table typically bearing the weighty presence of the family Bible. Thomas sat hunched over this very table, a single flickering candle casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted on the walls, mimicking the turmoil in his parents' hearts. He held a piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age, salvaged perhaps from an old, forgotten ledger, and a stub of charcoal, clutched in his small, almost translucent fingers. His fingers moved with an intense, deliberate precision, tracing lines and symbols that held no immediate meaning to Elias. The rhythmic scratching of charcoal on paper was the only sound in the otherwise silent room, a sound that seemed to hum with an unnerving energy. Elias approached cautiously, his brow deeply furrowed with a mixture of relief at finding his son and a growing, profound alarm at the sight before him. "Thomas, son, what are you doing awake so early? What is this?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, sensing the delicate, almost sacred fragility of the moment. Thomas did not look up, his concentration unbroken, his small frame rigid with focus. Martha knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his forehead, which felt strangely cool, not feverish as she had half hoped. "Thomas, you must rest, child. You look so weary," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. But even as her fingers brushed his skin, Thomas let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of untold ages, a breath that seemed to be exhaled from the depths of a profound weariness. His hand, still clutching the charcoal, dropped to the table, and he leaned back slowly, his eyes finally lifting to meet his parents. And in their depths, Martha and Elias saw a profound, almost ancient sorrow, a wisdom that no child of 10 should possess. On the parchment, now clearly visible in the dim, flickering light, was a map. It was not a map of Willow Creek, nor of the familiar contours of the Ebersol farm. It was a crude, almost childlike rendering of winding paths, a gnarled, unmistakable tree, a fallen fence, and a small, distinct X marked at a particular, chillingly precise spot. Below the X, in shaky, unpracticed script that seemed to struggle against the very paper, were the words that would forever haunt them. "Here lies Thomas Ebersol. Died October 24th, 1872. The map, with its chilling inscription, did not merely become the epicenter of the Ebersols' deepening despair, it became their entire world. Martha, her hands flying to her mouth, let out a choked cry, a sound of pure, raw grief, a wound torn open in the quiet dawn. Elias, though a man of stern composure, felt a cold dread, sharp as a winter wind, seep into his very bones, a fear far more profound and insidious than any he had known in his life of hard labor and stoic endurance. They tried, with desperate pleas and frantic questions, to reason with Thomas, to extract some meaning from the terrible drawing, to understand the chilling logic behind the terrifying date. But Thomas offered no explanation, no words that could unravel the knot of fear tightening around their hearts. He simply sat, his gaze distant, his small body a fragile vessel for an unimaginable burden, a knowledge too heavy for his young shoulders. Occasionally, he would point to a specific part of the crude drawing, tracing a line with a finger that seemed no longer entirely his own, a gesture that conveyed an unsettling certainty, a preordained knowledge that defied all logic, all comfort, all hope. The map was not a product of childish fantasy. It possessed an eerie precision, a detail that suggested an intimate, terrifying familiarity with the landscape it depicted. The days that followed were a torment, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow against their fragile peace. Martha clung to Thomas, unwilling to let him out of her sight, desperate to shield him from the ominous shadow cast by the date on the map. She coaxed him to eat, to play, to engage in any activity, however trivial, that might break the horrifying spell of the drawing. She told him stories, sang him lullabies he had long outgrown, anything to reclaim the vibrant, curious child she knew, but he remained unreachable, adrift in a world only he could perceive. Elias, usually immersed in the demanding, all-consuming work of the farm, found his thoughts utterly consumed by his son. He examined the map repeatedly, taking it with him into the fields, into the silent barn, his calloused thumb tracing the winding paths, trying to decipher its cryptic meaning, to find a flaw in its horrifying prophecy. He recognized certain landmarks with a sickening clarity. The ancient oak at the eastern edge of their property, its branches twisting like arthritic fingers against the sky, and the old stone wall that marked the boundary with the long-abandoned Peterson lot, now swallowed by encroaching wildness. The path depicted on the map seemed to lead deeper into the less traveled woods, a dense, untamed section rarely ventured into by anyone in Willow Creek, a place of shadows and forgotten things. The X, however, remained an enigma, a spot that Elias couldn't immediately pinpoint, yet about which he felt a chilling, almost visceral sense of recognition, as if he had always known such a place existed, waiting. As October 24th loomed closer, each setting sun a terrifying countdown, the Ebersol home became a place of hushed terror, a sanctuary invaded by a premonition of death. Martha barely slept, her eyes red-rimmed and perpetually searching Thomas's pale face for any sign of change, any flicker of hope. Elias found himself walking the woods, map clutched in his trembling hand, a silent, desperate prayer on his lips, trying to find the precise location Thomas had so chillingly marked. He spoke to no one in the community about the map, the shame and the sheer unfathomable disbelief too heavy to share. Yet the fear gnawed at him incessantly, a relentless, suffocating presence. The morning of October 23rd, the day before the chilling prophecy, dawned cold and clear, the air crisp with the sharp scent of turning leaves and the promise of impending frost. Thomas, who had been largely inert, consumed by a silent, internal world for days, exhibited a sudden, unsettling restlessness. He pushed away his breakfast, a rare and alarming occurrence, and rose from the table, his eyes fixed with an unnerving intensity on the window overlooking the autumn-painted woods. Martha, her heart a frantic drumbeat of dread against her ribs, watched him with an agonizing, almost paralyzing focus. "Thomas, where are you going, child?" she asked, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, barely audible above the sudden, shocking thud of her own fear. Thomas turned, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a semblance of his former self seemed to flicker in his moss-green eyes, a brief, fleeting moment of gentle clarity that pierced Martha's soul with a bittersweet pang of hope and despair. "I must go, Mama," he murmured, his voice faint, almost ethereal, yet imbued with an unshakable resolve. "The path calls." He then walked purposefully towards the back door, a small, solitary figure moving with a conviction that utterly defied his tender years, a child walking towards an unseen, yet undeniably real destination. Elias, alerted by Martha's sharp, choked gasp, was already at the door, his large frame blocking his son's path, his face a mask of desperate determination. "Son, what are you talking about? You're not going anywhere alone," he said, his voice gruff with a fear he rarely allowed himself to show. He tried to gently steer Thomas away from the exit, his hand light on the boy's shoulder, but Thomas, despite his small stature, felt strangely unyielding, his young body possessing an unexpected, almost unnatural rigidity. His gaze, once distant, now held a focused intensity that made Elias feel a sudden, cold prickle of dread crawl up his spine, a premonition of the inevitable. Thomas looked up at his father, his eyes wide and unblinking, holding a depth that seemed to encompass generations of forgotten knowledge. "I must, Papa," he said, his voice gaining a quiet, undeniable strength. "And the path is ready." And with a surge of strength that utterly belied his frail form, he slipped past Elias, his movements swift and determined, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped out into the cold morning air, into the unknown. Martha cried out, a sound of pure, raw anguish, and both parents rushed after him, their bare feet pounding on the frosty ground, heedless of the biting cold. Thomas did not run. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace as if following an invisible guide drawn by an unseen force. He walked past the weathered barn, past the old stone well where they drew their clear, cold water, and then, without hesitation, turned into the dense, ancient woods that bordered their property, a place of shadows and secrets. He moved with an uncanny familiarity, navigating the fallen branches and tangled undergrowth with an ease that suggested he had walked this path countless times before, precisely following the winding lines of the map he had drawn. Elias and Martha followed, their hearts hammering against their ribs, a desperate fear lending a frantic speed to their steps. They called his name, their voices hoarse with pleading, implored him to stop, to return. But Thomas seemed not to hear, or perhaps, in the depths of his mysterious journey, simply chose not to heed their desperate cries, drawn inexorably towards his chilling destiny. Thomas led them deeper and deeper into the woods, to a part of the wilderness they rarely, if ever, ventured. It was an ancient section, where the trees grew impossibly thick and tall, their venerable branches intertwined overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even in the full glow of the midday sun. The air grew colder here, damp and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, and the silence was profound, broken only by the frantic crunch of their footsteps on fallen leaves and the ragged, desperate sound of their own breathing. Elias, his eyes scanning the dense foliage, recognized the gnarled, ancient oak, its twisted form a silent sentinel now directly ahead, a landmark of chilling significance. Beyond the oak, the path grew even more indistinct, fading into a barely perceptible trail that led them through a cluster of skeletal or leafless shrubs, their bare branches like grasping fingers in the dim light. Thomas pressed on, his small figure strangely purposeful in the deepening gloom, his movements unwavering. Elias felt a growing sense of dread, a chilling, visceral recognition of the landscape Thomas had so eerily rendered on the parchment. Every twist of the path, every fallen log covered in velvet moss, every cluster of thorns seemed to align with the unsettling map. Each detail, a confirmation of the horrifying premonition that gripped his soul. Finally, Thomas stopped. He stood before a small, haphazard pile of stones, almost completely hidden beneath a thick blanket of moss, decaying leaves, and the creeping tendrils of wild ivy. It was an old stone cairn, perhaps a forgotten marker for an ancient boundary, or a long-lost grave from generations past, its original purpose obscured by the relentless march of time and the silent embrace of the wilderness. Elias had seen it before, years ago, when he had ventured deep into these woods while hunting, a fleeting glimpse in the fading light of an autumn afternoon, but he hadn't thought of it since. It was a forgotten place, an unremarkable mound of rocks swallowed by the insatiable appetite of the forest. Thomas knelt beside the cairn, his small fingers, now pale and almost translucent, reaching out to touch the cold, lichen-covered stones. He looked up at his parents, and in his eyes, there was a quiet resignation, an acceptance that chilled them to their very souls, a knowledge so vast it seemed to transcend time itself. "Here," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a fragile thread of sound in the overwhelming silence of the woods. "Here it is." He then laid his small hand flat on the top of the cairn, a gesture of solemn, profound finality, as if taking possession of an ancient, designated resting place. Martha, overcome with a desperate, primal grief that tore through her, rushed forward, collapsing beside him, clutching him to her chest, her body racked with deep, gasping sobs. "No, Thomas, no," she wailed, her tears wetting his pale, silken hair, her voice a raw cry of a mother's agony. Elias stood frozen, staring at the small mound of stones, the terrifying X from the map now starkly, undeniably clear in his mind's eye, a beacon of unspeakable sorrow. The cold dread that had gnawed at him for days, a creeping, insidious poison, now fully enveloped him, a suffocating blanket of despair, a realization of the irreversible, chilling truth. The sun, a dying ember in the western sky, began its slow descent, painting the distant horizon in hues of fiery orange and deep violet. But its light did not penetrate the deep, ancient woods where the Ebersol family knelt. Martha held Thomas close, her body racked with silent sobs, her face buried in his small, still form, while Elias stood vigil, his eyes fixed on the small, unmoving figure of his son, a sentinel of sorrow in the encroaching gloom. Thomas, since reaching the cairn, had grown impossibly weaker, his breathing shallow, almost imperceptible, his tiny hands cold to the touch, like stones in the deepening cold. There were no explanations, no final words of comfort, no last, desperate farewells exchanged. Thomas simply lay in his mother's arms, his gaze fixed on the darkening, intricate canopy of trees above, as if he were observing a grand, silent procession only he could perceive. He seemed to be listening, waiting for something beyond the comprehension of his grieving parents. A cosmic chime, a celestial signal. The air around them grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence, a profound stillness that felt both ancient and sorrowful, as if the very woods held their breath, bearing solemn witness to a tragedy too deep for words, a mystery too vast for human understanding. Eliason, in his stunned grief, tried desperately to recall any folk tales, any local legends, any whispers from the old settlers that might explain such an utterly baffling phenomenon. Willow Creek was not without its share of old wives' tales, of whispers of spectral figures flitting through moonlit clearings, of haunted glades where ancient spirits lingered. But none of them, not one, spoke of a child who drew his own grave, who walked willingly with such serene conviction towards his final resting place. This was something far stranger, far more personal, far more terrifying than any communal ghost story. It was a private, inexplicable tragedy, foretold and enacted by their own son, a truth that defied every known law of nature and human experience. As the last slivers of light finally faded from the sky, and the first hesitant stars began to prick through the deepening blue, casting a faint silver sheen on the forest floor, Thomas's breath grew fainter, a whisper against the profound silence. Martha clutched him tighter, her grip desperate, murmuring fervent, broken prayers, her face streaked with tears and dirt, a mask of inconsolable anguish. Elias knelt beside them, his hand reaching out to grasp Thomas's small, cold one, a silent, agonizing farewell to a son he felt he had never truly understood, a son who had lived and died by a path unseen, by knowledge inaccessible to the living. Then, with a final, almost imperceptible sigh, a breath so light it could have been merely the rustle of leaves, Thomas Ebersol was still. The woods remained profoundly silent, save for the gentle, mournful rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, a soft lament. The cold, unyielding reality settled upon them, heavy and suffocating, a blanket of despair. The date, October 24th, 1872, had come, precisely as foretold, and with it, the terrifying, agonizing fulfillment of the map's prophecy, a premonition that had unfolded with a chilling, inexorable certainty, leaving behind only grief and an enduring, haunting question. The journey back to the farm was a blur of grief and disbelief for Elias and Martha, a procession of profound sorrow under the gathering darkness. They carried Thomas's small, lifeless body between them, his weight no more than a child's, but the weight of their sorrow was far heavier, an unbearable burden that pressed down on their very souls. The path that had seemed so clear, so purposeful to Thomas, was now just a dark, winding trail through the oppressive silence of the woods, each step a testament to their shattered world. The farmhouse, usually a beacon of warmth and familiarity, its windows glowing with welcoming light, now seemed cold and desolate, its very presence a cruel mockery of their shattered hopes and dreams. The community of Willow Creek, though small and close-knit, struggled to comprehend the Ebersols' loss, or perhaps struggled to even acknowledge the true, unsettling nature of it. They knew Thomas had been a quiet child, prone to solitary wanderings, a bit different from the other boys, but the suddenness of his passing, coupled with the strange, unconfirmed whispers that inevitably began to circulate, left many bewildered and profoundly uncomfortable. Elias, a man known for his stoicism, for his unyielding silence in the face of hardship, refused to speak of the map, of the chilling prophecy, of the horrifying certainty of their son's final journey. He could not bring himself to utter the words, for they would confirm a truth too terrifying to share. Martha, however, consumed by her grief, by the desperate need to make some sense of the unfathomable, could only offer fragmented, tearful accounts of Thomas's strange behavior in the weeks leading up to his death, carefully omitting the map, fearing disbelief or worse. The local doctor, a kindly old man named Dr. Finch, examined Thomas's small body and found no obvious cause of death. No illness, no injury, no discernible ailment that could explain the sudden, baffling fading of life from a seemingly healthy child. He attributed it to a fragile constitution, a mysterious wasting sickness that sometimes afflicted children in the remote valleys, a clinical term that offered no solace to the grieving parents. Even he, a man of science and reason, felt a prickle of unease, a sense of something profound and unexplained hanging over the Ebersol tragedy. The official record simply stated, "natural causes," a sterile, dismissive phrase that offered no comfort, no closure, to the parents who had witnessed their son walk to his own grave. The map, that chilling artifact of Thomas's final days, became a source of both torment and a strange, morbid comfort for Martha. She kept it hidden in a small, locked wooden box, tucked away in the deepest part of her linen chest, taking it out only in the quiet solitude of night, when the house was asleep and her grief could find its voice. She would trace the familiar, unsettling lines, the marked X, over and over, as if seeking some deeper meaning, some final, whispered message from her lost son, a hidden code from beyond the veil. Elias, however, found it too painful to look at, too visceral a reminder of the incomprehensible events that had stolen their child, a wound that refused to heal. Life in Willow Creek continued, flowing around the Ebersols like a river around a stone. But for them, it was a hollow echo of what it once was. The once vibrant farmhouse, filled with the quiet energy of a child, became a silent testament to their profound, lingering loss, its rooms echoing with an absence that was almost palpable. Their days were marked by an enduring ache, a constant, dull throb of grief that settled deep in their bones. The Ebersols grew older, their faces etched with the deep lines of sorrow and the relentless passage of time. Their hair turned to silver, their movements slowed, but the grief remained, a constant companion. They rarely spoke of Thomas, the pain too raw, the mystery too profound, too terrifying to articulate. The map remained hidden, a silent, brittle testament to a truth they could not explain, a prophecy that had unfolded with terrifying, agonizing precision, a wound that would never fully close. The cairn in the deep woods remained undisturbed, overgrown with moss, slowly being reclaimed by the insatiable forest, forgotten by all but Elias. He would sometimes, in the quiet solitude of a late afternoon, when the sun dipped low and cast long shadows through the valley, walk to the eastern edge of their property, his gaze fixed on the dark, impenetrable tree line that marked the beginning of the ancient woods. He never ventured back to the cairn. The memories were too sharp, too vivid, the questions too many, too agonizing to confront again. What unseen hand had guided his son's small fingers? What strange, ancient knowledge had Thomas possessed, allowing him to perceive the very fabric of his own ending? Was it a premonition, a cosmic curse, or something far older, far more deeply rooted in the primal, untamed earth of Kentucky, a secret whispered from the very stones? The people of Willow Creek in time largely forgot the strange, unsettling circumstances of Thomas Ebersol's death. The story became a faded whisper, a peculiar local legend told only on cold, dark nights by the dying embers of a fire, the unsettling details blurring with each retelling, softening with the passage of years. Some whispered he was a changeling, left in the Ebersol cradle by unseen forces. Others murmured that he possessed a second sight, a terrible gift that allowed him to see beyond the veil of ordinary perception, a blessing and a crushing burden that had ultimately led him to his own demise. But no one truly understood, and no one, out of a combination of respect and fear, dared to ask the Ebersols directly, for the sorrow in their eyes was a silent, powerful warning. The small, simple marker that Elias had placed in the family plot in the Willow Creek Cemetery bore only Thomas's name and the dates of his birth and his untimely death. It was a public acknowledgement of his brief existence, a necessary formality for the world. But the true grave, the one marked by the small boy himself, the one that held the terrible secret, remained hidden in the deep, silent woods beneath the ancient, moss-covered cairn. It was a secret kept by the very earth, by the Ebersole themselves, and by the lingering, unsettling spirit of a child who had seen beyond the veil of ordinary life, who had walked purposefully towards his own ending. And so, the mystery of Thomas Ebersole endured, a haunting, melancholic melody woven into the very fabric of Willow Creek. The map, yellowed and fragile, still lay hidden in Martha's wooden box, a chilling, indelible reminder of a boy who, in 1872, had drawn his own fate, his own passage into the unknown. The ancient woods held their secrets close, guarding the resting place of a child whose final journey was a testament to the inexplicable. And the Ebersoles carried their grief, their profound, silent sorrow, with the quiet dignity of those who have witnessed something truly profound and utterly inexplicable, a truth too vast for comprehension, leaving behind only the cold echoes of an unanswered question, a permanent, unsettling presence in the quiet heart of Kentucky. The vibrant autumn leaves fell, winter snows came and went, blanketing the valley in pristine white, and spring returned with its relentless promise of renewal. But the Ebersoles remained trapped in the chilling autumn of 1872, haunted by the enduring memory of a small boy who had known his own ending, who had charted his own course into the great unknown. Years slowly, relentlessly passed in Willow Creek.
If you like this type of stories, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.